I'm Pam Schaff, and I'm the director of the Keck School of Medicine HEAL program, Humanities, Ethics, Art, and Law. I'm also the director of our new Master of Science in Narrative Medicine program. And today's program, which is called A Lunch and Learn, sadly, we can't offer you lunch today, but when we're back in the real world, we will. But this is an initiative whereby we invite scholars in the humanities, the social sciences, and other disciplines to share their expertise and to inform our collective understanding of the health of individuals, communities, and societies. So today we're so glad to welcome two individuals who will be in conversation today. The first is Dr. Lynn Boyd-Judson, who is co-chair of the Oxford Initiative for Global Ethics and Human Rights. And she is part of our faculty in the new Narrative Medicine Master's program and has been teaching this semester a course in narrative ethics. And we are also happy to welcome Dr. Julie Van Dam, who's an associate professor of French and director of undergraduate studies at Dornsife in the Department of French and Italian. Today, Julie and Lynn will be discussing stories of trauma and healing, global women's narratives, mental health, and disability in post-colonial and conflict zones. We will have time for questions and answers at the end of our discussion. So if you have questions as we go along, please feel free to put those in the chat. We'll remind you of that too at the end of their conversation. So we'll have time, I'm certain, at the end of their conversation for that. So with that, welcome Julie, welcome Lynn. I'm not sure, I think I heard that Julie is starting, but whichever of you is starting, please begin, and thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm starting, and just to give you an idea of kind of what we had discussed, we're each going to speak for probably about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we can open it up to questions. I will likely have some questions too for Lynn. But I just wanted to say, first and foremost, thank you so much for organizing this series. It's so important to have these discussions between the humanities and Keck. And my work has always been at this intersection, so it's very exciting and also a true honor to be invited, and especially with Lynn, whose work I value so much, and who has also been instrumental in helping me to articulate one of the classes that I'll be talking about today, which is called Global Women's Narratives. So, and students are actually actively working on their edits for interviews, which is very exciting. And so today, really, I'll talk a lot about teaching. And I am teaching faculty, so that was something that was not on the flyer. But I'm RTPC. I'm teaching faculty, but I do a lot of research. I found, though, that why I want to talk about teaching this semester is because, for all the research and planning I did for this semester, and I know we all did, building up to this online platform, which is, we were just saying earlier, so wonderful in some ways. It allows for such, so much more openness for participation in these kinds of discussions. And I find that for students, too, who are having difficulty this semester, it really is a platform that supports our current situation, which is one of crisis and illness, and in many cases, disability. But for all the research I did and all the planning, I found this semester that teaching is one of the most generative spaces I have felt in a very long time for continued research, for continued learning. We have the cliche of like, oh, our students teach us so much, and we all, which is, it's true, it's not just a cliche, but this semester especially has been really revelatory for me, as someone that comes from a francophone background. So I am in literature, I am in film, I studied French and francophone studies. Even explaining francophone to people sometimes gets hairy, but I am very deeply committed also to work that comes from Africa, the Caribbean, and especially women, and women's narratives. And what I found this semester is that tackling things from the post-colonial, which in the past I've had to really situate students, give them a lot of context, give them all the history and stuff, is so much easier. And I'll tell you a little bit why that is. So the two classes that I'll kind of reference today are Global Women's Narratives, which is French 105, and Global Narratives of Illness and Disability, which is French 375. That class has been in existence for quite a long time. Global Women's Narratives is new. Um, and I should say too that this is the first semester for Global Narratives of Illness and Disability, both of which I teach in English. Has grown to 50 students, which is with the grateful support of my chair, and I have a wonderful TA, luckily. And so this class, it counts as a GE, counts as a couple GEs, it counts for French, counts for narrative studies. And the beauty in both of these classes is I get a wide range of students from various disciplines: biomedical engineering, neuroscience, global health, of course, French. And so the discussions that we have in both of these classes are really interesting, sometimes difficult when students come from such different backgrounds, right? But they allow us to bridge the humanities and the study of illness and disability in ways that that I find particularly valuable, and especially in the context of today. I found that for discussing things like the post-colonial, it makes so much sense to them to think about the importance of the imperial encounter in, for example, discussions of COVID-19 and unequal access to healthcare and racial justice, and why the imperial moment matters. And so when I say post-colonial, it doesn't, they get it, and we can talk about it in really productive ways and open ways. And so all of the things that I teach are various kinds of narratives. So I teach anything from a novel to a film to a testimony to a music video to fine art. And really, what I want to do in my courses is always to privilege, excuse me, sorry, I was on such a roll. I have my notes and I'm not even reading them, and I'm like, oh, there we go, it's all happening. So this is the back end of everything, right? The door that opens to the right. And so by privileging narratives that come from Francophone Africa and the Caribbean, and especially from women, I want to think through for students what it means to come from a space of and speak from a space of the multiply marginalized, of the named from the outside, spoken for, spoken over. And this semester, for the first time, I've introduced a lot of narratives from the US. And this has been exceptionally important to create dialogue between what is seen as other, right? Like so far away, Senegal, Gambia, South Africa, wherever, the Caribbean, to think about how those spaces that are quote unquote far away, right, resonate with, and in fact need to be talked about with things that come from the US. For example, narratives from Audre Lorde, Black lesbian poet, writer, and author of the Cancer Journals, or a text, for example, written by two African-American scholars called Work in the Intersections, a Black disability feminist framework. So why these things can talk to each other, right? And so when we have been this semester talking about the post-colonial, we want to talk about these complex sites of emergence, and of emergence of narratives, right? And so by putting things in dialogue with one another, these texts from faraway places and things closer to home and much more recent news articles, for example, or social media posts in the last weeks, we go through the various moments of that imperial moment. So from the earliest origins of scientific racism, to the slave trade, to colonization, to the eugenics movement, and to contours of systemic racism, even in medicine. Students really can dive into very passionate discussions about the intersections of racial injustice, gender discrimination, COVID-19 pandemic, and disability. And so when I, first envisioned global narratives of illness and disability, it did not, it included many, many different narratives that, for example, were from white France or other spaces that did not necessarily always think through issues of race and racial injustice. And it was this semester that I really took all of that out and only focused on narratives that revolved around gender and race. But to back up a little bit, I want to provide a sort of framework for the idea of narrative too, because like the narrative medicine program and this talk as well, thinking through narrative is especially important when thinking about illness, disability, and also very crucially race and gender. And so I really like to go back to G. Thomas Kauser's idea of narrative, in that narrative is that which comes to define and release subjects of illness and disability. And I'll quote, he traces the relation between somatic variation and life narrative. And this relation, as he traces it, is dynamic and multilateral. So it works in many ways, right? And so I want to propose, if, as he states, and I quote, for many people with disabilities, and I would add illnesses, okay, culture inscribes narratives on their bodies willy-nilly. So if he states this, then for Black and brown women, this narrative inscription cuts even deeper, but so do their own life narratives. And this is where I, in my class too, want to play with this idea of how narrative can define and further exacerbate, for example, health disparities or certain health conditions, whether it's related to disability or illness, and then how narrative can also provide a throughway, right? And I focus on these particular narratives not just because I was in a French department and I really loved living and working and studying in Africa, and those were the narratives that I was really drawn to, but also because of the value of minor narratives. And I really want to kind of reflect on the idea of minor narratives as opposed to master narratives. So when I teach both of these classes, I introduce students to Jean-François Lyotard, and I have my little board. I will not write it on the board. I didn't do it. As you can tell, I did not do a Google Slides or PowerPoint. I think I'm PowerPointed out from the semester. I'm just like, whoa. Anyway, so I'm just talking. In any case, in the chat, I will put his name. So Jean-François Lyotard, just like as a little, and so in his estimation, master narratives are worse, especially subject to a dismantling in the postmodern era. And what came to dismantle master narratives being, the big story that we tell, whether it's proffered through science, medicine, history, politics, economics, what have you, culture, was dismantled by minor narratives. And I like his idea of minor narratives, but I'm much more in tune with the idea of a minor narrative as that which was articulated by Françoise Lyonnais and Shumei Shi on the idea of minor transnationalism. And for them, minor narratives are those small narratives that speak across spaces of minorness, speak across spaces of marginality. And this is what I was referencing in, not explicitly earlier, but now explicitly, between, for example, a Senegalese autobiography and a text that comes last year on the importance of feminist theories of Blackness and disability. And so speaking across minor spaces is what I really want to allow in these two courses. And so to come back to a reference I just made to kind of elaborate that a little bit. So by, for example, reading and then returning to a really important critical article that I mentioned earlier, Work in the Intersections, a Black Feminist Disability Framework, and this is by Moya Bailey and Azetta Autumn Mobley. And if anyone would like any of my my bibliography, I can send that to Pam and Erica and they can distribute that if you're interested. And so reading this text, right, and returning to it becomes second nature when we're thinking about these minor, talking across minor spaces. When reading Senegalese author Ken Bougel's autobiography, The Abandoned Baobab, even though it was published in 1982, takes place in the 60s and 70s, and this text from Bailey and Mobley is from 2019, because by bringing them together, students, and me myself too, can see how longstanding ideas about Black women's bodies, sexuality, and abilities contribute to both physical traumas and mental illness, not only in the post-colonial context of Western Europe, but in our current one here in the US. One can see, for example, how the ableist narrative of the strong Black woman not only can lead to unequal healthcare delivery, as hopefully many of you have seen and heard about in recent times, but also pathologizes any and all sense or sign of fragility, vulnerability, or even just basic need, right? For support, for interdependence, etc. And so when I'm teaching about trauma, I mean, we title this talk trauma, but when I'm teaching about trauma and illness and disability, we don't divide them into some kind of clear definition of what is what, right? But instead think about it on a continuum. On a continuum of health, on a continuum of ability, and even question sort of the underlying assumptions about ability, about bodies, about what we're expected to do, to perform, how labor works into it as well. And so what I've noticed too this semester with the COVID-19 pandemic and racial injustice and the really important attention that's been given to the current, not just past, right, but the current disregard for Black and brown bodies, but the openness and eagerness of students that to open up definitions of illness, disability, and trauma, so that it's not just that which can be attributed to anything mental or physical, but that which can also work itself out in the body in unexpected ways, through affect, through whether it be, affective or somatic, and then how to definitions of illness, disability, and trauma, as I referred to earlier, it can exacerbate pre-existing conditions, for a better, for lack of a better term. And I have to say too that introducing students to complicated work is worth it. Undergrads who are taking this class for GE credit, I've found them to be really open to working through things like Frantz Fanon and his seminal work from 1952, Black Skin, White Masks, that allowed them to conceive of affective trauma and disability due to racism. So not just something that might exhibit itself in the body or on the body as something visible, marked, a paradigmatic disability, right? But that can express itself in different ways. And they also got into Christopher Bell's Blackness and Disability, which led them to think about what it might mean to inhabit a CRIP space. And CRIP, for those of you who don't know, is a sort of new iteration of disability studies. CRIP theory aims to take disability and illness outside of maybe official like medical diagnosis or institutional spaces such as the ADA or even disability services programs here on campus. And so to think about a non-hierarchical definition of inhabiting a body that may or may not function in the cultural norms of ability of focus, right, as I'm showing you now. And so what it might mean to be in a CRIP space you know, they also have the benefit of me who does these kinds of studies and this kind of work. So they also probably think of me as like the most accommodating professor, and I probably am, much to the dismay maybe of colleagues who are like, why do you allow them to turn in papers so late? That's not true. It's a case by case basis. And you know, we talk about it and the whole thing anyway. But I do have flexible deadlines over the course of a week. And I have to say, I recommend it to everyone, not just who are in disability studies. It helps. And so, you know, on that, sort of bridging that from the idea of official medical diagnosis and all of that, I kind of want to sit for a minute too with the word healing. So we talk about healing a lot in my classes, but and Lynn and I chose it for the title, but I want to say that in my work and in my classes, healing is less associated with some kind of biological or chemical process. It's something that a body and mind can do, of course, but we really aim to think about healing outside of the paradigm that dominates discussions of illness and often still disability, that binary of cure or triumph on one side, right, versus tragedy or death on the other. And that the triumph one is really hard to get students out of, like deprogram the idea of triumph. Like, look at how amazing they are, even though they're disabled, you know, this kind of like inspiration porn that Stella Young has referenced in a TED Talk that went viral. In any case, and so to unthink that binary is also one that really makes us interrogate the idea of cure culture, the sort of cultural imperative for cure. And that is not to say that medical intervention and treatment is not essential, you know, for creating quality of life, but it's to think critically about what cure culture means and what the emphasis on cure and survival really do to the ill and or disabled subject. And we also talk about healing in terms of a process that activates itself through the active narration. So writing one's illness, speaking it, filming it, etc. It is a continuous process that never really comes to a decisive end, much to my students' utter disappointment when they get to the end of a novel or a film and they're like, oh, like we wanted to see the happy ending, you know. But this is not what happens in these narratives, right? If we would listen to as well to Arthur Frank, for whom telling a story through the wounded body is one that will always be sort of in this in-between zone, right? So he notes it as the remission society. So even if one comes to a place of healing, as one defines it for themselves, right? That possibly unmarked illness or unmarked state is still present. Hence his term, the remission society, being in remission but not actively ill or actively or visibly disabled. Um, and so in conclusion, I just wanted to share a couple narratives that I teach in my classes that I believe contribute to, I've been talking about postcolonial, but that I believe contribute to a decolonial definition of health, ability, and women's storytelling. And these are, one of them is more well known, the other one is very, very small. So Trin Minha in the 90s wrote Woman Native Other, Writing Post-Coloniality and Feminism, 1995. And she is a documentary filmmaker and post-colonial feminist theorist, excuse me. And she was really the first to bring together these worlds. It's a really seminal work. And so I teach the chapter called Grandma's Story, and Grandma's Story is a real valorization of the women's tradition of storytelling, and is very political in its working against Western norms of what constitutes a good story, right? History with a capital H, etc. And so for Trin Minha, the act of women's storytelling is political, it is visceral, it is vital in the sense of life-sustaining, life-giving. It's effectively a speech act that activates bilateral healing within the storyteller and the listener. And in the context of trauma and the dyadic exchange between teller or patient, excuse me, so teller/patient, and listener/healer, Minha writes, they derive their power from listening to others and absorbing their daily realities. While they cure, they take into them their patient's possessions and obsessions and let the latter's illnesses become theirs. End quote. And so here I feel that her estimation of the listening process could possibly be linked to the practices of narrative medicine, right? So that in this case, the doctor, right, the supposed healthy, able-bodied one, takes in the experiences of the patient in order to provide real care, right? Similar to, I think it was Jeffrey actually who quoted Pamela in that earlier, and it made me think of that too. What the act of listening does, right? And how it also creates a almost tangible connection between the listener and the teller, between the doctor and the patient. And the next narrative that I'll just briefly touch on is a documentary film by Hadi Sila, which is called An Open Window. And it was from 2005. It's a documentary film that's at once a biography of a woman in her neighborhood and an autobiography. And it is about mental illness, women's experiences with mental illness and treatments in Senegal. And so what she wanted to do was really film the story of this woman and her own, and how one navigates in post-colonial Senegal in the 2000s between, on the one side, Western colonial era approaches that call for medication and confinement in former colonial era camps, actually, and on the other, traditional ones that allowed for and even encourage an active outing of non-normative behaviors, speeches, gestures, in conjunction with a healer who she herself is formerly ill. And still ill in that way. And so she takes her camera, points it on the woman who is the subject of the biography, and then points it back at herself, and has ongoing dialogues with a Western style doctor, ongoing dialogues with a healer, and really wants to create a collaborative portrait, one that really echoes with Minha's Minha's claim as well. And these are just two narratives that I'll stop here. I thought I had not enough, and now I realize I've been talking for a very long time. So I will, because we're talking about mental health here in my last little, especially my last bit, I think it's a really good time to pass the mic now to Lynn. And also, I also like to always avoid a clean conclusion to these kinds of things in light of avoiding, clean cures and everything's rosy at the end. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Julie. It's always such a pleasure to hear about your work. Let me see what I can you all, Pam or Erica, I can see both of you. Would you let me know when it's 10 till when we need to close? It'd be about 50, is that about 15 minutes? Great, thanks. I'll watch for you because I'm going to try to talk with my glasses off. So you might have to do this a bit. It's delightful to be here. I want to talk about something a bit different but building on where Julie started. Part of this amazing program that Pam has started with Erica and Medical Narrative has been such a gift to those of us teaching in it because of its interdisciplinary nature, its multidisciplinary nature, its ability to fold in so many interests that not only we have as faculty, but as practitioners, as activists, the students come in from different disciplines, that I'm going to make a bit of a jump with you, if I may, because I want to talk some today. I have some women's voices that I want you to hear. I want to put those maybe front and center. I have 3 different excerpts from narratives that I've taken in a Global Women's Narratives project that's housed at this Oxford initiative that I share with the group of colleagues. What I want to do is make a shift a bit to women's mental health and using narratives in a way that has potentially more to do with international law, with human rights, with policy, with public policy, with global health policy. So taking the individual back up to the global sphere to see how we can help women, help individual women better understand potentially what their challenges are that we're well aware exist. Plethora of the literature out there is huge on the challenges to women in mental health, in trauma, in violence. The issue has been, well, how do we gain traction? How do we change that? What do we do about that? And so I want to explore that bit of narrative, if you'll allow me. I want to, acknowledge before we get into the 3 narratives that I want to explore a bit with you today. First of all, that although I have been at my most careful of pulling out excerpts and keeping language in there that might be graphic or upsetting, that each of these narratives will refer or talk backwards towards perhaps some violence, in some cases sexual assault. And I want those of you to be aware of that who might like to be aware of that. Each of the 3 will have some. Danielle, I want to talk first about a general that I want to just acknowledge. Some of this that I'm going to throw at you quickly in the statistics parts, that I'm going to put some numbers in between these women's stories to try to make it more palatable to you. But some of it is coming from a paper, a thesis I just wrote in international human rights law. And I looked at international human rights law, the state's responsibilities, and women's global mental health, and the issues that we have there post-violence, post-trauma, post not only gender-based violence, but also armed conflict. And where I want to start is even earlier than that, because I want to make a general statement that the fact that there is no society or community in the world where women are treated equally to men has inevitable consequences on the mental health of women, period. So the line where we're starting is already pushing up to see. We're already, when I read you percentages that are disturbing, I want to start there. I mean, this is economic, it's development, it's familial, it's community, it's religion, it's a variety of things, it's governments, it's patriarchy. but this part is where we walk into these stories. So here's Danielle. Danielle was interviewed. She's a stand-up comedian in Los Angeles. She was an interview for my Women's Narrative Project. She's one that was just a couple of years ago. She didn't become a comedian until she had an accident in her early 20s, which she says changed her life. She lost both of her feet and is now disabled. Elisa D'Angelo took this narrative. I'll start in her voice. This is when she's talking about going to college. My dad said, just be an accounting major because I was really good at math. Accounting has nothing to do with math. It's just putting things in piles and organizing, which is fine and easy enough. So yeah, I went to college for accounting and I immediately thought, wow, I hate accounting. I just showed up for my ballet class, my voice classes, my English Shakespeare classes. I did not graduate with an accounting degree. I actually was asked to leave. I was kicked out right before I got in my accident and lost my feet. So no one in my family talks about it or brings it up. It's like, well, she's disabled now and has spent 2 months in the hospital. She has to reevaluate how she fits in the world. So maybe let's not hurry her too much about finishing school. Later, when she's talking about her stand-up comedy, she talks and she has language in here about sexual assault and her abortion, which is part of her act. She says, I talked about the awful shit I had to deal with. It's funny, but obviously these are real lived experiences that I'm talking about. If you're not disabled or in a wheelchair or Latina, you can still relate to what I'm saying. Thank you, Erin. If you can pop back out of the screen again. So that's starting to give an idea of violence, and I'm bringing in the idea of the sexual violence she talks about, and going into this place of dark humor that she talks about, feeling like she can connect with people and she can share herself in ways that up on stage she doesn't really have in other areas of her life, and has affected her life in that way. Quick numbers on violence, because I want to put it back up to the global really fast. 35% of all women globally have experienced intimate partner violence or sexual violence. Some countries have this figure at 70%. Almost a third of women who attempt suicide were battered women. The World Health Organization estimates that 60% of women who have experienced violence do not report and do not seek help. So even with the numbers we have, we're looking at a huge number of human beings globally, women who've experienced violence. I want to take this because for the past couple of decades, globally, United Nations, CEDAW, the instruments that we have in international law have really been spending a lot of time and resources on alleviating violence against women, gender-based violence. We've gained very little traction. The numbers have not gone down like we'd want to see them year after year after year. So what I want to suggest today, and we're going to wrap it into the use of narratives, is that we pause with this, realizing it may take a generation or two to really see the numbers shift in our culture and patriarchy and how and women violence against women. To think about, if this exists, if women are being harmed, then let's look at their mental health on the other side of it, because that's something we can take action on now. We can work with states, we can work with community centers, social centers, we can use different types of scalable therapy. So to quick numbers with that, mental health disorders associated with violence, PTSD, anxiety, depression, are triple the rate of men globally. Over 50% of women live with mental illness have previously experienced some sort of violent trauma. 75% of women attend substance abuse treatments as victims of interpersonal violence. Almost a third of women who attempted suicide were battered women. And PTSD is experienced somewhere between 31 and 84% of women who have fallen victims. I'm going to do two quick narratives, and I think that's what I'll have time to do. I want to pause in here because the two narratives I'm about to share with you are actually conflict narratives. One is from Belfast, one is from Bosnia. So if I jumped back to a later part of this to say that to put in the numbers, how to think about this is 42% of women in Kabul, in Afghanistan, in a recent study, met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, 97% for major depression. 21% indicated they had suicidal thoughts extremely often or quite often. And this is where I'm seeing that not only are we taking individual narratives from around the world, but if we can use these also as a way to give it therapeutic value for the women, for the communities, to have women leaders be able to, within their own communities, recognize depression, recognize trauma, have places to go, have groups of safety. If I forget, and we have to do this in the question, please ask me about the program we're starting with Zimbabwe, UN Women, one of my partners, and in Colombia with the Vice Minister of Justice there that's more connected to their government and domestic violence. But I want to get these women's voices in there. Let me do this and I'll be done. It's pretty quick. Can you toss, Erin, I believe next is the one of a prison. Can you see that one? This is a woman from Belfast that I interviewed. I have been teaching for about 5 to 7 years, these short courses in Oxford, and we take students to Belfast, to Greece, to Cairo, wherever. Anyway, and when we're there, we interview women. And this is a woman I interviewed with my students who was a former combatant and had been in prison for 8 years. I will say that the highest rate of PTSD in a population is in Northern Ireland. It's 40%, highest in the world of lifetime. And I want you to listen in these next two narratives for the intergenerational sense of this, the importance of it, for the community of healing that's needed, and for the lack of mental health care or accessibility is AAAQ in international law. So here's her story. I was arrested at 17, just almost turned 18. I was arrested and went to Armagh prison. I spent 8 years in prison. I'd love to say that I went to Armagh really hardcore, political, really revolutionary and all of this, but I didn't. I went in like an awful lot of people did. They went in with that anger off the streets, with that injustice. I came from an area with 18 streets, and in those 18 streets, there were 15 people shot dead, and one of them was a woman, an elderly woman sitting, having her tea at tea time, watching the television. That was my background. That was what filled me. He, meaning her husband, who had also been in prison for a long time, different prison, of course, got out of prison. And we were getting on a wee bit. So we thought if we were going to try for children, we'd try now. The unfortunate thing was that I lost 3 babies when he first got out, had 3 miscarriages. The third child, we discovered there's a big scandal here about organ donations. And we found out people who had died, especially babies who had died, that hospitals were taking their organs without asking permission or giving any sorts of details. I had investigated that myself and found out that my daughter, who had died of a syndrome, they had kept her organs. So we had a wee bit of campaign. She's an activist now, going there, to get her organs out and all that business. It was all very traumatic and very hard. The unfortunate thing about it, and I'm not making excuses for my husband is an alcoholic. He got out of prison in the same mindset that he went into prison. He just couldn't cope with the freedom, couldn't cope with the changes that happened over the 22 years. It's a whole lifetime. And he just couldn't handle the situation out there. The rest of us cope, you have to cope. What resulted with our family were some incidents of domestic violence. It was a tragedy to me personally. My private life is my private life, and I hated that everyone knew. That's why I was so interested when you said about the help you can get. Our prisoners never got that. Our prisoners got out of jail and they were just left. And some people say that was the fault of the Republican movement. But the Republican movement is made up of volunteers who do things because of a commitment, because of a belief. And yes, we did drop the ball with a lot of prisoners, and we didn't give them the backup and the help that they should have gotten. But, but the services were just not there. Next, could you go back to the hillside?
So Lynn, you're at 10 minutes left.
Thank you. This is 2 minutes. I'm going to have to do this one. I'm totally done.
Okay. Bosnia.
This is the hillside where these women in Bosnia were interviewed by Lena Perencia, who was one of the students in Oxford. My aunt was in the camp, this is the woman saying, with my mom who was younger. My mom repeated this story constantly, the same story. They pick you up at night, they bring you back in the morning, and then they pick you up at night. The military, imagine military of 100, so every night, and most of them are older men. My aunt, her sister was 50 years old, never got married. They took her one night, same night as my mom, but they never brought her back. They abused her, killed her, and threw her somewhere. There were two sisters. Serbians would knock the door with the military boots and they would cover. These women were old women. They had traditional garb on. They would grab the women, take the women to the next room. Is more graphic description. Women come back. They're like chickens. They would be next to each other, sitting on the floor, next to each other with the kids. And that's the final comment. Did your mom ever talk about what she felt like when she was there? It's not customary to talk about feelings. Don't even know how you would bring this up. We would talk about events, what we experienced, who would give us something to eat. What happened is when she gets up at 2 o'clock in the morning now, she says, they're there. They're right there, right now. It was 25 years ago, as if the war is starting tomorrow. So I fear if I were to ask her details, she immediately starts. My mother can't. After hundreds of times of hearing this at 2 a.m., I started screaming like, this is too much. I can't do this anymore. I can't hear it anymore because I'm exposed to this day in and day out. It's too much for me because I am the caregiver to my mom. Stop. And then if what this brings for you, if you can pop out of the image now, and I'll close. It's just the idea of if we're looking at mental health and the use of narrative in any way that's legal or public policy oriented, that's also could be therapeutic to these individual women and their communities, that there is a sense and a movement now to make this scalable, that we're working with, that should reach this incredible number of women and families and towns that need it in a way that we seem unable to stop violence against women. Does that make sense? I will stop. Thank you for allowing me, Pam, as my moderator, to go over by a couple of minutes, but I wanted to get her voice in there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. And thank you, Julie. Please, if you have questions, put in the chat. And I see Dr. Wright has requested that as well. So gonna get my view right here.
Yeah, thank you both. A lot to think about and a lot of kind of getting at our work from a couple of different angles, but the role of narrative in teaching, but also, you know, how teaching starts to kind of be broadly defined in terms of what is our role with individuals, but also globally, and in terms of policy, you know, transforming perspectives. So a couple of things, I think, Julie, when you were talking about how you're providing frameworks for understanding different students to understand different concepts that they think they know, health, trauma, cure, and sort of disrupting that, and how the current moment has allowed us new access to a new, you know, easier in some ways, some aid in getting at those concepts. And I think isolation has become one of those sort of commonalities that allow us to think through these concepts in a different way. And so I know that's for my students too. They have a new understanding. So if you wanted to talk a little bit more about how you know, see these terms as kind of getting disrupted, and especially in relation to Lynn's call for helping, you know, provide therapeutic responses for these women.
Yeah, yeah, and I think this question too is also, you know, is one for Lynn as well, because I feel that in the past, you know, when I've taught kind of my module on trauma and post-colonial trauma, and we bring in testimonies from the Shoah Foundation, so they see testimonies from Rwanda. I used to do Rwanda and the Holocaust. This semester I'm just doing Rwanda, but and in the past it's been harder for them to sort of wrap their minds around how trauma connects to illness and disability. And so I'm interested to hear too, you know, anyway, that does not happen. This has not been happening this semester. And they're just able to more broadly conceive of how these terms sort of like feed into and bleed into one another. And I'm interested too, for you, Lynn, if in your experience in thinking, through like the terms, mental health or mental health and mental illness and trauma, if you have found, because you work a lot with students, and how they for example have done interviews with people in conflict, with women in conflict zones. I would think that kind of work really forces students to understand how they come together and how it also then manifests in the body, etc. Whether we're in like our current age of COVID or not. Can you speak to how students have engaged with those ideas and how easily they can kind of navigate between them, in terms of like mental health, trauma, physical, disability or illness, etc.?
So I tell you, Julie, it's hard for me to answer that because I don't come from the same premise. Because and part of it is because when I'm looking at this, I'm teaching about why it's important. I'm teaching about why it's intergenerational, how it affects women's health for the rest of their lives, in many cases, and their children's lives, and depression and anxiety, how it's makes it harder to work. They don't make as much money, right? They can't leave husbands. Lots of that, so all of that, all the social dynamics, the cultural dynamics, the family dynamics outside of the personal, we're talking about those in class. And I will say now that I have not had, and that people are quite open about talking about their own experiences so that they quite well understand the significance. I was surprised by the percentages and the numbers when I got into this area of law, that it's not, that countries are giving 1% of their health budget to mental health, when to me, it seems like it would resolve and help resolve so many other issues that are long-term and expensive for states.
I think Jeffrey has a question or comment.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, really appreciate your presentations and really just kind of integrating the different lines of thought around things. For me as a psychologist, intergenerational trauma, right? We know a lot about that. The idea of, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris and her work on ACEs, right? That's really become, as our first, Surgeon General of California, she's really elevated this idea that adverse childhood experiences lead to poor health outcomes and disability. And so I think it's just very timely that we're paying attention to that in our country as well as in other countries. And it's really become a significant item on our agenda. And then lastly, as a clinician, traumatology, I'm expert trained in PTSD from the National Center for PTSD in Boston. And we just see this way that trauma threads through the lives of veterans, men and women.
Yes.
In children directing a pain clinic, about a third of our patients in the pain clinic will ultimately reveal a trauma history, whether it's interpersonal and or environmental, community, household, domestic violence, schoolyard shootings, stabbings, bullying. You see a high level of trauma associated with chronic pain or other chronic illnesses. And then lastly, the idea of self-medicating around trauma. We haven't really talked a lot about substance abuse, but alcohol, legal marijuana now, other drugs and pills and et cetera. So I just think that these threads, so common globally, and they really have not sought or received the attention that they need to, and you're contextualizing them in really important ways with regards to justice and women who obviously have had much higher rates and incidences of trauma as reported. We see, I mean, if you go back to like pre-Freudian times, like hysteria, right? What was hysteria? Hysteria was like almost all women. What does that mean? Right? Well, it was underlying trauma that went undiagnosed. And then that turned into shell shock, which was then combat related PTSD. And then, I study things like medical PTSD, kids that are diagnosed and treated with chronic illnesses like cancer or sickle cell disease. And so you see these threads, and it just takes people to pull them all together to think about that whole person and that whole experience. So I just commend you for great talks, and I appreciate that. And I think we see
You
this.
know, and Jeffrey, what I'm thinking of when you're saying it too, you'll know this from the veterans work, the whole idea of soul wound that comes out, the holistic nature of it, and the fact that it's lifelong, and you have to involve the community, right?
Absolutely.
That part of it is, I think, where we're moving
Mhm.
to get into some of these communities.
Yeah, and I like, in my world of pain management, we don't talk about panacea per se. We talk about management. It's in the title of pain management. We're teaching people how to manage their pain or their chronic illness or manage their trauma. It doesn't ever get erased, unfortunately, as much as we'd love to see that happen. It's helping people figure it out. And how do I function in my life? And how do I contribute in my life? And how do I live a full life? It's not like it ever goes away, unfortunately, the traumas. It's just about managing them. So I'll just stop there. I can talk.
Great comments, great comments.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, and thank you, Lynn and Julie. Thank you all for being here. I'm sorry that we have run out of time. Such a good and important conversation. And I know there were a few questions in the chat or requests for bibliographic material. So Julie, I'm going to hold you to that if you would send us. And Lynn, we didn't have time for your program further conversation either. So if you send us information, we can push that out to the RSVP list of folks, and we're happy to share that. So again, thank you for important work, important conversation, and to all of you for being here. Look forward to next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.